Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this webinar on Toronto's climate futures, planning for 2030. This webinar is intended to support the City of Toronto's consultations on its short-term plan for the 2026-2030 period, a critical period for climate action. We are delighted that 146 people have registered for this event, which is just really wonderful to see so much interest and support for climate action and climate justice in this city. Next slide, please, Shelley. Brief pause, no worries, we'll get there. Shelley, I'm not hearing you if you're having some difficulty moving ahead on the slides.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop and come back just because of I am. Okay?
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
We'll get going again in a moment. While Shelley's just bringing up the slides again, I'll introduce myself. My name is Anne Keary, she, her pronouns. I am with the Toronto Climate Action Network. I'm the co-chair of Toronto Climate Action Network with Chloe Tse. TCAN, right now, Shelley, I have you in my screen in the corner. I'm not sure if that is the same for everyone else. And I'm not sure if that is something that, David, you might look at. But in any event, just to let you all know, Toronto Climate Action Network is growing fast. We are an umbrella organization. We now have, I believe, 75 or 76 member groups across the city, and receiving new applications all the time, which is also really heartening. We have a mission to collaborate among our diverse action-oriented organizations to confront the climate crisis, really strengthen climate resilience, and advance climate justice. And we are doing this both at the community level and at advocacy at all levels of government. So thanks again for joining us, and we will now turn to the land acknowledgement. So Shelley, over to you for the land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Sorry. You know, something that worked well a minute ago. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Are you able to move the slide to the next one?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay.
But I'll do the land acknowledgement in any case in order that we don't waste time.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I learned from a chief of the Namgis First Nation that the proper way to introduce yourself is to say who you are and where your family's from. So that's how I start a land acknowledgement. I'm Shelley Gordon. At the beginning of the last century, my ancestors were settlers in Treaty 6 territory, and that's the traditional and ancestral territory of Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples. It's what we call Western Canada. Today, I live and we're meeting in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. People attending our meeting today are from many different locations and each have your own story. We are so thankful for the land and the water and the air that have sustained us. We acknowledge we are settlers who occupy lands from which Indigenous peoples were dispossessed by colonialism. This has resulted in their ongoing material impoverishment, loss of sovereignty, and dependence on colonial laws. These colonial laws and practices continue to give access to and control over Indigenous territories by and for fossil fuel and extractive industries at the base of climate change. In this meeting and in our actions to mitigate climate change and build a just future, we will try to learn from and practice First Nations teachings from who have stewarded our environment for so long, and hope that we can help to ensure that our air and land and water are safe for the next 7 generations and beyond.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Very good words to open with tonight. Not sure if it's possible for you to move to our next slide. If you're able to, we can move to just some housekeeping items. So just to remind everyone to mute while you're here. We're encouraging everyone who's just arrived to please put your name, pronouns, and where you're from in the city. We would like to keep the chat for questions. So if you have questions, Lynn Adamson, who is also here, will be monitoring the chat for questions. And we would prefer that you don't, that our participants for this evening don't engage in extensive debates in the chat, much as we love everyone's participation and enthusiasm. But please feel free to share any relevant links in the chat. We'll certainly be saving the chat and saving any wonderful resources that are shared. So with that, I will now just go over the agenda. First up, we will be hearing from David Miller, opening remarks. We will then have an engaging panel discussion with How-Sen Chong, Gaby, Kakapos, and Maggie Chang. We'll then move to an overview of the city's consultations. TCAN is also going to do its own survey. We'll introduce the Wards Project, which is an exciting new project to build political will for climate action in the city. We'll have some facilitation best practices guidance with Anjum Chagpar. Then we'll move to breakout sessions, and then we'll close for the evening. So it is a jam-packed schedule, as you will see. So with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing David Miller, who will be presenting some opening remarks about the situation in which we currently find ourselves. David is the Managing Director of the C40 Centre for City and Climate Policy and the Economy. As you all know, he was Mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010 and served as Chair of the C40 Cities from 2008 to 2010. He is a leading advocate for the creation of sustainable urban economies and the author of 2 books, Solved: How the Great Cities of the World Are Fixing the Climate Crisis, which many of us here will have read and are keen to apply these ideas here in our own city. We absolutely believe that Toronto can be and is a climate leader, and we need to be all doing all we can to push that forward. David holds a degree in economics from Harvard. He's a lawyer by training from the University of Toronto and recipient of many honorary awards. So David, thank you so much for joining us, and we're delighted that you're here to share your thoughts and wisdom on the times that we're in. Over to you. Thank you.
And thanks very much for that really gracious introduction and for having me tonight, but more importantly for the work that TCAN's doing, particularly in the context of last week's American disaster. The ability of residents of cities to organize around climate change and the ability of city governments to implement really advanced climate strategies has become critically important. It always was important, but when one of the world's leading emitters is clearly not going to pursue climate action, it's really incumbent upon those who can to do everything in their power. And city governments only really act when people are with them, and sometimes when people push them. I think it's critically important that TCAN is organizing to ensure that Toronto's plan and progress is as advanced as it can possibly be. So I thought it might be helpful if I just spoke for a few minutes about what I'm lucky to see globally from my work with C40 cities, and then take some questions if that is suitable, Anne. And I assume the questions will be through the chat, as you said. So first thing that we all have to acknowledge, and if you're following the COP at the moment, it's been full of bad news. Argentina took its negotiators home. The COP started late because they couldn't agree on the agenda. And, I was at the COP in 2009 when Canada, under the Harper government, were trying to delay climate action. One of the things, the Harper government and Russia and a few other terrible countries, and Canada was among them. I think we need to be honest about this to ourselves. One of the things they did was make frivolous objections to things like the agenda just to slow down the possibility of climate action. So we're seeing a well-worn playbook. The second thing in that context is at the same time that we're seeing, I think somewhat organized efforts to undermine the COP process, we're seeing the world reach levels of temperature that are very, very close to tipping points. The Paris Agreement at its highest ambition, and that was an ambition that Canada had played a huge part in having exist, because it wasn't until the very end of that COP going to be even in the document. At its highest ambition, wanted to hold overall global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We're there, and emissions are increasing. The one ray of hope for me from a governmental perspective is the actions of cities. And that's why I wrote the book Solved, so that people would know the story of what cities are doing. And, C40, which started out as 40, but is now nearly 100 of the world's largest cities whose mayors have self-organized to help the world avoid climate breakdown. It's a single-purpose organization. Following Paris, had its annual summit, or its biannual summit, excuse me, in Mexico City, the year after Paris. And Mayor Eduardo Paez of Rio was the chair at the time. And he asked his fellow mayors to agree to a program to do what science said was necessary for their cities. And to give you some perspective, C40's membership today represents urban areas of around 700 million people. So it's like a huge country, and there's really significant cities: Beijing, Rio, obviously, Paris, London, Cape Town, and of course Toronto, in every part of the world. And it was agreed that it would be a membership requirement, as of that time, to have a climate plan that committed you to doing your share of what was necessary to help keep the world on a 1.5 degree trajectory. More in the global north, because historically we're bigger emitters, a little bit less in the global south. And the idea was that you would peak emissions by 2020, have them by 2030, more or less, because that's what science says we need to do. In global north cities, it needs to be more than having, on a path to net zero by 2050. To be a member of the organization, you had to have made that commitment. Every member that exists today did. Some were invited to leave because they didn't. And you have to show progress on your commitments. And as of today, just over 80% of C40 cities are ahead of their national governments in climate reductions. And a number like Toronto have made very significant reductions, including peaking their emissions. But progress is starting to stall, even within the cities. So what do we see globally in the successful cities? First of all, they have to have a climate plan. In general terms, it addresses buildings, transportation, waste management, and generation of electricity. A number of them address food as well. And in general terms, the cities that are successful win the argument on climate change and fight the political battles necessary to win. So what are they doing? Well, first of all, they're addressing active transportation and how a city is built in order to ensure it's built in ways that people can live in a neighborhood-friendly city, often called 15-minute cities. But this concept's all around the world and has different names in different geographies. But the basic idea is you try to densify a city so people can have their everyday needs met a short distance from their home that they can take transit, or walk, or bike to. They do not have to own a car to live a meaningful life and have their daily needs for recreation, work, healthcare, entertainment, green space, etc. Really critically important. Toronto's official plan lays the groundwork for that. It has actually since Mel Lastman was mayor. But in this push for housing we're seeing today, there's a massive risk that the province is going to steer housing to the Greenbelt, exacerbating all the problems. And it's critically important in Toronto's case that we ensure that as we provide needed affordable housing, it's done in a way that conforms with those ideals. So what else are cities doing? Extremely high building performance standards, clean construction to build the buildings, significant work on rewilding and resilience, and I can talk about that more in the questions if people are interested, and a real push for clean transportation. So we saw the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, fight his entire election, and his opponent made this the issue on the ultra-low emission zone in London, which is kind of a tolling, but it's based on the emissions of your cars. Anybody who's been to London in the last couple of years will know they have an extensive bike network and literally bike traffic jams. It's the most incredible thing to see commuters in London. But there was a real push to stop this measure, and he fought it on the grounds of public health. We're doing the right thing for the climate, but we're doing that for the reason that we are protecting the lungs of young people, children in London, particularly those in low-income neighborhoods that live near the busiest traffic routes with diesel, et cetera, et cetera. And he won the argument based on that connection between climate and health. And it was a bitter fight, but he won and was reelected. Mayor Anne Hidalgo in Paris won and was reelected on fighting about the pedestrianization of the Seine, which created all sorts of benefits beyond climate, made both these efforts make the cities a healthier, safer, more interesting, more vibrant place to live. Probably the most interesting thing that's being done at the moment is something called climate budgeting. And C40 is leading this work. Toronto has got its toe in the water, but in a very Canadian way, of course, we're good at piloting things, but not always at taking them on wholeheartedly. Oslo is the leader, but they're not the only one. Schwani in South Africa is also doing climate budgeting. And what that means is for the city government, not the city region, Toronto's climate plan is for the region, the geographic area, and the emissions are measured for the geographic area. But for the city budget and what's directly within its control, you have to get through the normal budget process, you have to get an allocation of carbon as well as an allocation of money if you want to do something. And the carbon is capped to what fits within the city's climate plan for the city government's emissions. So what that means, it forces the rec department, for example, when it's building a new hockey rink, or the library when it's building a new library, or the roads department when it's thinking of transportation networks, to think about its carbon emissions as well as the cost. And it's done through the city budget process because public servants understand that process and there's a routine. And this was piloted in Oslo, and I think is one of the most powerful things if we think about that from the context not just of cities, but of large businesses, federal governments, provincial governments, all saying everything we do the carbon has to be measured, and we can only emit so much carbon as an entity. So if you're going to do something, you have to find a way to live within that cap. It's a really, really powerful and important program, and something I think Toronto could take a leadership role on. One final point on what we're seeing globally is that Chinese cities are way ahead of everybody. And China is justly criticized because of its heavy reliance on coal, and that's true. And they should be criticized for it. But it is also true that they have empowered their cities to make change. So we see in North America, transit properties starting to buy electric buses, although the federal government still funds hybrids. And we saw Hamilton's last purchase, I believe I'm correct, was all hybrids. Shenzhen, China, all of their buses are electric. They have 16,000 of them. Their taxis are electric. And what's more, they've used that to drive a job strategy in Shenzhen around creating manufacturing, and the world's largest manufacturer of electric vehicles, well, certainly electric buses, and I believe electric vehicles, but I stand to be corrected on that. BYD, or Build Your Dreams, is based in Shenzhen. So their climate strategy is also a job strategy. And one of the things we can learn from China is they're making these decisions to do the right thing, and then they implement it and do it. And I think that's something we can all learn in the city of Toronto and elsewhere. We're past the time where we should be piloting and making a few small changes. The things that work somewhere and are proven somewhere, we need to do at scale rapidly. A couple more comments. I've sent an article to Anne, and I'm sure she'll circulate it, that I wrote in the Globe the other day about natural gas. One of the biggest problems we face in North America is the use of gas for heating and cooling. And it's a massive problem because the industry has created an idea that it's cleaner than coal. That is true at the point of burning, but as a system, it is not true. It is more or less as dirty as coal. C40 did a study to prove this because of methane leaks in the pipeline system. LNG is even worse because of all the energy used to create it and then to recreate it once it's shipped somewhere. And this is a debate we need to win at the city level. And we're seeing the fossil fuel industry fight back very strongly in the United States. In small towns that want to say new construction should not hook up to gas, they spend millions and millions of dollars in advertising to try to stop it. And they're wrong, because gas is not a transition fuel. It's exceptionally important for us to use what tools we have, and that includes, in Toronto's case, things like the Green Building Bylaw. Is it possible for Toronto to imitate cities like New York and say, you can only emit this much carbon? I think they call that building performance standards. How-Sen will talk more about it. But we've seen this. New York's the best example of that. Vancouver has an amazing building code that is driving carbon out of its buildings. And that's a fight we need to win. Because if we don't get a handle on gas, we can't meet Canada's obligations. We can't meet the United States' obligations. And those are things really that start in cities with brave city governments speaking up on behalf of their residents who actually want to live in a clean and vibrant city. So I think that's what I wanted to say. Quick reminder, we need to have emissions by 2030. This is really urgent. And without the voice of people speaking up, the system won't show the backbone needed. And I do think in Toronto's case, we need to think very much about climate budgeting. We could be a global leader. We need to think about building performance standards. We need to think about rewilding. It's critically important to our ability to withstand the increasing severity and frequency of storms. And I do think we need to win the fight on bike lanes. I'm a cyclist. We no longer own a car. We haven't for years. I don't want to have to risk death to go around my daily business. And what we're seeing is a city that could grow into a city where people truly don't have to own a car. And that's going to need the support of really active, engaged residents if we're going to win it. So that's what I wanted to say. I think I left a couple of minutes for questions, and thanks so much again for having me, but more importantly, for doing the organizing work that you're doing. It's absolutely critical.
Thanks so much, David. I know we have a bunch of questions in the chat and we may not be able to get to them all. Lynn, you're our chat moderator. Did you want to bring up, I think we might just have time for 2 questions if that's possible.
The first one is from Stephen Douglas. Toronto needs a climate progress dashboard based on its Transform TO commitments, meaningful measures, timely updating, and upfront profile to the public. From your experience as mayor, is this not a relatively simple thing to put in place?
Yes. Yes is the short answer.
Okay. Well, maybe
there's no measuring carbon in the context of an urban region like Toronto is tricky, but Toronto figured that out a long time ago. In fact, when I was mayor, being transparent about it is not difficult.
Yes, okay, so it could go into TCAN's submission to
Absolutely. Transparency is critical. People need to know what's going on.
okay, next question. It's in connection with the reference to rewilding. Do you think international and municipal agreements and plans for climate change and biodiversity loss are being integrated effectively? If not, where are they falling short?
Well, I think, first of all, the biodiversity COP in Montreal 2 years ago was really important for the fact that for the very first time, cities were recognized as an important actor in trying to prevent further biodiversity loss. And the figures are even more worrying than climate. It's something like 72% of species on land and 80-something% of species in water. It's really quite shocking. I think municipal efforts are really important. I don't think we've quite captured the public imagination in the same way that people understand we have to do something about climate. They may disagree about certain things, or they might not connect other things like bike lanes to a climate strategy, and that requires leadership, I think, both from residents and politicians. I don't think we're quite in the same place on rewilding, but I do think there is massive potential because people get there's something wrong. They see how bad the storms are. There's a powerful story in Toronto because the only reason we have ravines is because of Hurricane Hazel in 1954 and the conservation laws that were passed afterwards to protect them. And I think you can really get people on board with rewilding, but I don't believe the international and city agreements are particularly coordinated yet. And really, that's because it's been very hard for the international community to acknowledge the role of cities in biodiversity or in climate for that matter. They are now, but I think it's going to be some time for them to be really integrated. So my argument would be that's a battle cities should lead on. People love nature. They love being in nature. Torontonians love their parks, ravines, waterfront. Look, if you go on Toronto Island in the summer, it's packed with people from all over this city. And it just speaks to people's connection with nature. So I think that's a place maybe cities have to show the lead and take it to the international community rather than the other way around.
Thanks so
Okay,
much,
thank you.
David.
Can I just wrap up here, Anne? With
Sorry,
the,
yes.
The last question had to do with the way to fight. Does the city have a way to fight back from the province to remove the bike lanes? I do note that there's a resource link that I think Philip has put in the chat to find information about how we can speak up to the province. There's also petitions that Lead Now and city, the faculty put out. So there's ways to get involved. But David, is there anything you want to say about how the city can fight back to the province?
Yes, I think it starts with us. We have to speak up. And, there's a group of people in a neighborhood who are really upset that their commute downtown's been made longer. So, fair enough. Maybe there's some solutions. Maybe the design needs to be tweaked. But people who care about climate, the environment, about a livable city, about air quality, and about public safety need to speak up. Nobody is in favor of cyclists having to weave in and out of rush hour traffic, including drivers when they think about it. So I think people have to speak up. I think the city has to fight, and it's a political issue. We won on the Greenbelt. Doug Ford wanted to give huge swaths of the Greenbelt to a few friends. I mean, let's call it for what it is. And we won. So I think this issue is winnable, but people need to understand that it's in a context that's bigger than just why do you have bike lanes, at Royal York and Bloor. And by the way, in my neighborhood, Hyde Park, there's a counter, and it's almost at 400,000 cyclists passing Pacific and Bloor this year. So if you hear people say, oh, nobody uses it, tell them that fact. There'll probably be maybe not 500,000, but 450,000 by the end of the year riding along Bloor. And that's a heck of a lot of people that deserve to ride in safety.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. I know that there's a lot of activism, and I will be addressing the opportunities to speak up at the province. And there've already been some really significant bike rallies, and I think there's a lot of energy to fight back on that. Thank you again for all of those thoughts. We have to, keeping with track of the time, we'll have to move now to our panel session. So actually, Shelley, right now we'll have How-Sen will be first up, in fact, and How-Sen is going to be sharing his own slides for this portion. So a brief introduction to How-Sen. I know he is known to many of us here. How-Sen is the climate campaigner with Toronto Environmental Alliance. He was born and raised in Etobicoke, and he has been a climate and climate justice campaigner for nearly 25 years. He holds environmental degrees from McGill and Yale and is certified in organizational greenhouse gas accounting. He's worked with several environmental organizations, Indigenous Climate Action, Environmental Defense, Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and he is a real believer in what we can do here in Toronto, and how Toronto really can be a climate leader and why we need to push for that. So, How-Sen, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, David Miller, for speaking. I remember the days when you were a mayor, and a lot of the things that we have in the city is a result of his leadership and the leadership of council during that era. So yeah, thanks again for all that work, and of course for the work that you continue to do today. I'm going to go kind of briefly. We've already kind of gone through information about myself. We've done this already. If you want to note my email address, you are welcome to do that. I'll also send a link to our newsletter in there. So a little just briefly about Toronto Environment Alliance. Toronto Environment Alliance has been in the city for over 35 years. We have over 60,000 supporters, and we're supported mostly by individual donations. We're a small team. We're about 8 or 9 people. And here's a random list of things that T has accomplished, usually with partners, usually with community groups, oftentimes with more regional or national organizations as well. So everything from action against smog to transit expansions to buying local policies at City Hall, stopping garbage incineration, the green belt, the tree protection bylaw, all these types of things T has worked on for the past 35 years. So I'm going to get a little bit into the less fun side of climate change. We all know that there are significant impacts on climate, and based off of studies done by the city and studies done by organizations like the United Nations, we know that there are going to be significant impacts on the city. So we do expect that by the 2040s, we may get up to 66 days with temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius. And of course, that doesn't mean that all the days will be at 30 degrees. A lot of them will be significantly higher as a result because of the raising of that particular curve. We are expecting 30% more rain and snow by 2100. And then we're expecting significantly stronger storms. And we saw an example of that this summer when we got over 200 millimeters of rain over a period of like less than half a day, leading to significant floods. And so in order for us to prevent that from getting worse, not only for ourselves, but also for people around the world, we have to do multiple things at once. And that includes cutting emissions. And there is good news and bad news in terms of that. We have hit our 2020 emissions target. In fact, we hit our 2020 emissions target as far back as 2011. And that's primarily because the province eliminated coal from our electrical system. That's how dirty the coal was. Unfortunately, the amount of emissions coming from electricity is going up because the province is adding much more gas onto the system. And so we have some significant challenges there. We saw during the COVID years of 2020 and to a lesser extent 2021 that our emissions started going down close to our 2025 targets. And then the most recent number that we have is from the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, where there's been a 7%, almost an 8% increase year over year between 2021 and 2022. The Atmospheric Fund will be releasing its 2023 numbers next week. So for those of you who are tracking this, go to TAF's website and they have a webinar. They'll be announcing what the emissions will be looking like from their emissions calculations from 2023. So our goal for 2025 is 45% less than the 1990 levels, and then by 2030, 65%. This is challenging for us to reach. A breakdown of the city's emissions, and this is just for Toronto, shows that the majority of our emissions actually come from buildings. I will try to speak up. Eva, you're saying that you can't hear me? Okay, I will try to speak up and I will get closer to the microphone. So we can see that the majority of the city's emissions actually come from buildings. When you ask a lot of people what the largest chunk of emissions are, people will oftentimes say transportation. That is the case in some municipalities around the city, around Toronto, but in Toronto proper, it's primarily from buildings. It's primarily from the heating of indoor air and water for buildings as well. So on the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown based off of the energy source of where those emissions come from. And on the left side, you'll see that it's the breakdown based off of end use. And so over half of our emissions comes from one source, gas, which means one company, Enbridge. And that is a challenge for us because they keep expanding their gas system. Thankfully, we do have a net zero climate plan. And this actually, I know a lot of people may be thinking about the American election and what happened last week, but just so you know that we were able to get this climate plan passed, this net zero climate plan passed, primarily during the last time the president-elect was in power, between the years 2016 and 2020. And so and this is all done because of the work of passionate people. In fact, many of the people in this room are partially responsible for that work as well. And so that's why we have a climate plan today. And so going back to 2021 and 2022, we actually made the climate plan more stringent because the original plan was to get net zero by 2050. And that was actually made more stringent to get to net zero by 2040. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is all because of the work of people in this room and other Torontonians across the city, and we can do it again. So the 2030 goals are coming up. We'll be speaking a lot today, later on, about what those 2030 goals are. But what the city is doing right now is setting up the short-term plan for the 2026 to 2030 period. And I have here listed, broken up between buildings, energy, transportation, and waste, the different goals, the key goals that the city needs to reach in order to hit our 2030 goals. So for buildings, for example, since David Miller mentioned that before, all new homes and buildings have to be near zero greenhouse gases by 2030, and existing building GHGs need to be cut in half. And so what the city has for that first one is what is known as the Toronto Green Standard, which was put in, I believe, in 2010, and is iterative. And we are expecting a new version of that next year, I believe. And then the existing building emissions also need to be cut in half by 2008 levels. The city is looking into implementing what they already have in places like New York, which are known as building performance standards, which sets maximum amount of emissions per square foot the building is going to be able to emit from their energy use. Other things we need to do is we need to get 50% of our emissions, 50% of our energy coming from renewable or low carbon sources 25% of commercial industrial floor area needs to be connected to low carbon thermal energy sources. One of the greatest examples that Toronto has for low carbon thermal energy sources is the lake water cooling and heating system that we have through Enwave. And they are expanding that system out into Etobicoke, I believe. Not into Etobicoke, I'm sorry, that's a ground source heat pump. But they are expanding that system, and I believe they just started a new pipe into the lake. In terms of transportation, and I'm sure a lot of people are interested in this now, the 2030 goal is 75% of all transportation under 5 kilometers are walked, bike, or by transit. A 5-kilometer distance is about a 15-minute bike ride, and over 50% of all road transportation is under 5 kilometers. So over half of all road transportation is within a 15-minute bike ride. There's an EV target there, and there's also waste and consumption targets as well. This may sound pretty daunting for us, but we are not alone. It's possible. Now, I haven't seen any particular study that proves this, but the climate movement may actually be the biggest social movement humanity has ever created. It's hard to say, but if you think about, there's literally millions and millions of people on the planet right now having conversations like this in their communities. And positive changes are happening very, very quickly. So in the UK, this is actually going back a little bit. The UK, as of, I think, last month, their grid is now coal-free. This is the country that invented the use of coal as electricity and power generation. And then for the first time in the EU, wind and solar have outpaced fossil fuels as a source of electricity. I'll also talk a little bit about adoption curves. I remember looking at this. I was so fascinated by this, looking at like adoption curves over time. And an adoption curve basically says that change is slow until it's very, very fast, and then you reach saturation. And every type of thing that we take for granted has, in our day-to-day lives, likely has something close to an adoption curve to it. And so, I mean, this only goes back to 2015 when like smartphone use was less than 75%. And that's, 10 years ago. And I don't know many adults who don't have a smartphone today. So, so these are things to consider as well. Things may seem slow until they move very, very fast, but it is our job to make sure that those changes happen faster. And then some of these changes, even with changes in administration in the United States, they still pumped $500 billion into the economy on green technologies, green tax breaks, things like that. And then China, their clean energy investments in 2023 was $890 billion. There's a massive amount of change happening, and we all benefit from this, as well as benefit from all the work that everyone in this room is doing and everybody who is talking about this is doing elsewhere. I am from here. I used to work a lot in like national and international climate work. David Miller was mentioning Copenhagen 2009. I was there in Copenhagen. And yeah, one of the reasons I'm so excited about Toronto is because Toronto is probably more impactful to Canada than New York is to the United States. We have about 20% of Canada's GDP, just under 20% of Canada's population. If you look at New York City, it's about 7%. And so any changes that we make here can and will have a significant impact on a G7 country, on a country that's both part of the both part of the Francophonie as well as part of the Commonwealth. And so there's significant impacts here. And Canada actually has a history going back to the 80s, although we've lost some of that. But going back to the 80s, Canada had a history of leadership on the environmental file, on the climate file, and we can do it again. And so that's kind of like it. I wanted to end with a little bit of a pep talk, and I'm really excited about the conversations that we'll be having later on. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, How-Sen. And thank you for highlighting those very steep uptakes and the ways in which change can happen so quickly, and also for really highlighting how significant Toronto is and the changes that we make here are really significant. And it reminded me actually of something I heard on Twitter, which speaks to this current moment, that we should focus somewhat less on how climate action has been derailed and more on how it can be decentralized. And that is here in our cities. Shelley, I think we actually have Gaby up next. So I know Gaby is going to speak without slides, and so I will now introduce Gaby. And thank you again, How-Sen. Gaby is joining us. She is the Executive Director of the Clean Air Partnership. She has been working to motivate and support local government action on clean air and climate change for over 20 years. So she has directed and delivered programs for municipal governments, businesses, schools, including the Clean Air Council. Previously worked with Sustainability Network, and she is incredibly knowledgeable. So we're very grateful for your presence here today, Gaby. So over to you, and looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, How-Sen, for kind of really setting the stage. I wanted to kind of use this as an opportunity to try and drill down on two of the actions that How-Sen kind of spoke to with regards to the City of Toronto's Transform TO initiative. And then the first one that I'll speak to is about the Green Development Standards, the City of Toronto's Green Development Standards, which is absolutely critical. And I really want to give a shout out on how important City of Toronto's leadership on advancing green development standards has been, not just for Toronto, but for the whole region of Ontario as well. So it started out in 2010 with Toronto advancing the green development standard. Right now, we have about 12 other municipalities who have green development standards in play and or advancing them within their municipalities as well. So that triggered a lot of leadership that Toronto showed and then made it a lot more possible for other municipalities to follow in Toronto's footsteps. Now, we are at a stage where at present, the green standards that have been in play thus far have advanced the efficiencies. They've advanced the efficiencies of the building envelope, but they really haven't forced the fossil fuel phase out. They haven't really challenged the system of how we heat our buildings. That is going to change, and that changes with version 5 of the Toronto Green Standard, which really is a leap to the next stage that really forces the hands of new developments to remove the use of fossil fuels for building heating. Now, they could still possibly be using fossil fuels for water heating, and that's okay at this stage on the game because we're still working on some of the economics relating to water heating in terms of geo-exchange systems and water heating. But for building heating, this is going to be a game changer in terms of energy systems and low carbon energy planning that developers need to do with their buildings. And that is really, really important because that takes us away from the please, please, pretty please, will you do something on carbon, to really pushing and scaling up the actions and using regulations to change the systems. And we have to challenge the systems in order to get that scale up that we know we need to achieve our science-based greenhouse gas reduction targets. So that's the first thing that I really wanted to highlight. The next version of the Toronto Green Standard is going to be a game changer in terms of energy systems that new developments advance. That is going to be a challenge. We are going to face a lot of pushback from the development community as a result of that system change. And it's not surprising that we will, because there's a whole system set up to enable their fossil fuel use. But there isn't necessarily a full kind of silver platter low carbon energy system that's available to them. They do have to work with other utilities. They have to work with non-regulated energy utilities, but there are utility models that can address those upfront capital costs in the same way that Enbridge takes on all of those upfront capital costs for their natural gas system. Anyone who tells you that natural gas is cheap to bring all of that infrastructure and all those pipelines to new developments that's not accurate. It is not cheap to provide all that infrastructure. It's just that there's a system and a rate base that pays for all of that infrastructure to be brought to new developments absolutely free. The rate base subsidizes all that. Now, what would we do if we had such an energy system that our business model for low carbon energy systems do you think we would have as much problem as we're having now, begging developers to move forward on low carbon energy planning? No. And that is where the system change really needs to be moving towards. That's why it's going to be so important, all of your advocacy, all of your work, talking to your communities, talking to your neighbors about how important it is that Toronto advances towards its version 5 of the Toronto Green Standard. That is going to be critical. We need all the support because we are going to be facing a fair amount of resistance from the development community. And they're going to be using they're going to be using some of the language that we all talk and we all care about: affordability, adding to upfront capital costs, keeping people out of the housing market, all of those things that we all care about. But they're going to be using that as a justification for removing or reducing the ambition of the Toronto Green Standard. We need to challenge that. And one of the key aspects of how we challenge that affordability argument, because that's not a low carbon problem, that's a business model failure. And we need to be addressing that business model failure. So one of the things that we really need to be raising is bringing that connection, saying that, you know what, if we don't build it right in the first place, we're just bunting this responsibility down to a future time period when we're going to have to be retrofitting these buildings. And if we brought in those retrofit costs into those new developments and the economics associated with going low carbon right at the time of construction, which I have to say is the cheapest, most affordable time to be bringing in these low carbon energy systems at the time of construction. We want to avoid future retrofits because those are going to be more expensive than building it right from the first place. In addition, that's really where you see the nice kind of dance, shall we say, between the Toronto Green Standard and building emissions performance standards that Toronto is going to be working on in the coming years. And that's where existing buildings and new buildings can really help support each other and achieve the scale up that we know we need to get to. And rather than just kind of always relying on the carrots of please, please do some low carbon energy planning. So I did want to kind of highlight about the importance of the building performance standards, because Toronto has had a home energy loan program that has provided low interest loans to Toronto residents to help them address that upfront capital cost associated with retrofitting their homes and decarbonizing their homes. But it's been getting a couple of hundred Torontonians to go through this process. They just got a new tranche of funding from FCM that has increased the number of people, but it's still small scale, and it's not at the scale that we need to be at to achieve our GHG reduction targets. Building performance standards are critical to achieving that scale up. They also are critical to helping to build the business case and the rationale for advancing low carbon energy systems right from the point of construction and avoiding future retrofits. Because if they brought in that calculation and consumers started asking, wait, what have you done for low carbon energy planning? Is this going to result in me having to do a future retrofit? Am I going to be kind of in a stranded asset conditions where I now have to eliminate my fossil fuel furnace from my home because of building performance standards before the end of its lifetime? And how much does that stranded asset cost risk bring into my calculations? So all of these conversations are this dance that takes place between the moving from these voluntary programs, or moving from, the voluntary programs of retrofits and supports towards a scaled up approach. But what's really, really critical is not only the community support, the community conversations, the talking to counselors, because this is not going to be an easy fight. This is going to be a big challenge for us to move forward on. And we're going to need support from the community. Residents are going to have to be calling their counselors saying how important this issue is, how important building performance standards are, and the fact that we need to help residents and property owners go through this process. We can't just say, here's the building performance standards and good luck with that. No, we have to set up these programs to support people to go through and develop their decarbonization roadmap, and to do it in a way that's equitable, because there are going to be some people who can't afford to pay those upfront capital costs. How to be able to do that? How do we get the financing and the low interest long-term financing in order to enable them to really, in my kind of put it, I call it a free retrofit, which is what I mean by a free retrofit. Not that it's free completely, although I do think that certain income brackets should be given free retrofits, but that's a different topic that we can discuss. I just wanted to kind of highlight that the free retrofits, the business model that we need to advance is where we can get people to provide that upfront capital costs to them so that they can do this work, and then their energy savings can pay back that loan payment over a period of time. This needs to be done at individual residential households. This needs to be done in multi-unit residential buildings. This needs to be done in commercial and institutional buildings, and this needs to be in industrial buildings. This is one of the biggest economic development opportunities and job creation opportunities available to us. These jobs are labor intensive, they have to be met locally, and they transfer energy cost dollars that leave our community and for energy efficiency work that absolutely has to be delivered locally. So in addition to the climate argument about why this is absolutely imperative, there's also the economic development opportunity and the job creation opportunity that we should not lose sight of, that we need to also bring together into the conversation. But we're going to need a lot of people talking about building performance standards and green standards and the importance of them, and talking to their counselors about that too, because we're going to need a large coalition of people to fight the resistance that we're going to get from the powers that be and some very influential fossil fuel players, as well as some developers who are not going to want to change their energy systems. And I'll leave it at that, and we can kind of have a conversation later on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maggie. That was super informative, and we have our work cut out for us. I think we absolutely need a communications strategy on the building emissions performance standards, because it's not something that rolls off the tongue super easily. But I love the connection with jobs and the potential there for connecting with unions on this, with Toronto Community Benefits Network. There's a lot of potential for really building a coalition on this. So thank you so much. We are running a little behind, and it's a super rich conversation and so much great information, but I want to move now to Maggie. And I think, Shelley, I might try and share my slides, because it seemed like you were maybe having some challenges there for Maggie. But first, I want to briefly introduce Maggie to you all. Oh, Shelley, thank you. Let's see if it works. Yay, it does. That's amazing. So Maggie is a poet, writer, and artist whose environmental journey started in first grade when she learned about deforestation of the Amazon in school. Since then, Maggie has organized a UN Sustainable Development Goal training, served on the NRCan Youth Council, and become co-chair of the City of Toronto's Climate Advisory Group, a position that she shares with Lynn, who is also here on the call. She is a certified Wildlife Foundation Canada Living Planet leader and a top 25 under 25 environmentalist. So thank you so much, Maggie, and over to you.
All right, so I just have a couple of slides around the City of Toronto Climate Advisory Group, just because I think there's a lot of information about it that'll be a little bit easier to follow if they're on slides, and then I'll be speaking just without slides. Yeah, so as Anne mentioned, I'm here in my capacity as co-chair of the City of Toronto Climate Advisory Group, the CAG for short, as well as to share my perspective as a youth working in the space. So for those of you unfamiliar with the CAG, here's a quick rundown. It was established in 2022 to give feedback to staff about achieving city net zero by 2040 goals. There's 25 to 26 people on the group who are representing relevant organizations and businesses, as well as community members with sustainability expertise. We have quarterly meetings, as well as some sort of deep dive workshops. For transparency, our meeting summaries are posted on the City of Toronto's website. And there's also currently no major council involvement. Another way we're set up to work is through working groups. So we have 7 main ones identified, including buildings and energy transitions, engagement, working with other levels of government, waste, climate resilience, transportation, and energy generation. And then some of the topics we've covered in meetings include equity, electric vehicles, the budget, carbon budgeting, Indigenous engagement. So this is what the city has going on, but obviously we're only one group of people. And we really want more big, bold ideas to be dreamt up and suggested to the city to achieve the climate action we need. Speaking on behalf of myself and many other CAG members, if you approach us, we'd probably be happy to talk about your ideas and potentially bringing them up at our meetings. Next slide, please. To give a better sense of where we're at. Oh, sorry, it was the previous slide. Yeah, there we go. A few months ago, the city did put out a report that measured our progress toward net zero, and it did conclude that we're on more of a business as planned scenario rather than a net zero scenario. Just reading some quotes from the report. Toronto's community-wide GHG emissions for 2021 were 41% below 1990 levels. That was a 4% increase over the 2020 number. The council set targets are 45% reduction by 2025, 65% by 2030, and net zero by 2040. I did want to highlight as well, though, that this report did talk about quite a few wins, too. The first one is around the Toronto Green Standard that Gaby just talked a lot about. The TTC is also planning to be ahead of schedule for having a zero emissions bus fleet. And finally, in 2023, Council did sort of make Toronto the first city in North America to enshrine its climate change goals and governance processes into law through the new Climate Change Goals and Governance chapter in Toronto's Municipal Code. So that's around the carbon budgeting being held accountable by this municipal code to publish that and be transparent about that. Next slide. So this report also included percentage updates on the short-term implementation plan actions, and I'm just going to do a quick summary here for you all. So the completed and ongoing completed actions, many are around sort of construction and EV charging, near zero emission new constructions, consultations for EV charging, supporting resident-led climate action through events, climate action grants, and designing carbon budgets. Some of the half-finished actions includes things like increasing pedestrian and bike infrastructure, cycling routes, increasing TTC service, increasing canopy cover, and supporting green innovation. Actions that were listed as about 25% complete included a lot of behavioral actions, such as encouraging EV uptake, encouraging circular economy behaviors, developing tools to address emissions and air pollutants, working with Indigenous right holders, youth consultation, equity indicators, sustainable procurement, and net zero city-owned buildings. The good news was that most actions not started were very minimal, and they're around sort of updating and reviewing certain plans and strategies. So my quick summary analysis for that is, for me, it kind of looks like the city has been able to complete more technical, concrete implementation plan actions, such as those around new buildings and EV charging, but more complex, nuanced issues like Indigenous engagement and equity are taking longer. Arguably, these things need to take longer, but at the same time, it's a little bit frustrating that it might not have been integrated throughout the process. And it also looks like action is being taken across the board, just not at the speed that the city planned to be. So I'll end that part with the slides now. I'll just continue speaking. I was also asked to share some thoughts on engaging communities in ways that are meaningful to them. For that, the best piece of advice I can give is an approach that we talk about a lot in our engagement working group, which is that instead of approaching things with a climate first lens and talking about co-benefits like health and well-being, you should actually start with the things that are front of mind for people, the things that they already care about. So start with the health, start with the home, start with the job, start with the transportation, and then offer climate as a bit of a co-benefit. I think it's also relevant to note that a lot of the emissions reduction work does in some ways need to target sort of middle and higher income folks because they're the owners of the buildings emitting 56% of our emissions and so on. But the importance of consulting everyone, particularly marginalized folks, is around making sure people feel empowered to do their part. And also to make sure that the suggestions we provide are not making anybody fall through the cracks. Another key thing to remember is that 95% of Toronto's emissions are not within the city's direct control. They're under community control. And so the city is also, from what I've seen, pretty understaffed considering the magnitude of this issue. And also they have limited funding. So we really need to think about ways to galvanize everyone to do their part and consider how the city might support these community efforts. Now, this brings me to my section on youth activism. I really wanted to highlight the challenges that we face and how important it is to consider how your suggestions and feedback would support youth in the climate space and how you might integrate that into your own work and practices. Because to put it into perspective, less than 40% of youth-led climate organizations have paid staff. I've also seen stats that something like less than 1% of the funding that goes to environment goes to your youth organizations. So it's pretty dire for us out here. And I think something that isn't talked about enough is that youth are very vulnerable. We don't even get a vote in our democracies until we're 18, but we're the ones facing half or more of our life expectancy under these extreme climate change impacts. And then as you hit 18, you start facing issues like having a lot of student debt and networks that aren't really large or developed, creating issues with leaving unsafe work environments, especially if you are a first or second generation immigrant. And that is the experience of the majority of racialized or Black and people of color in this country. So the sustainability field literally becomes not sustainable for us because we end up volunteering all our time and burning ourselves out because we care. Or we can only get 6-month or 1-year contracts that have us always worrying about surviving. Or we're struggling to compete with people who have literally been working for longer than we've been alive. And that makes us feel barred out of doing meaningful work in the space. And it's really frustrating because we have all this energy and these new innovative ideas, and it feels like we have no support. And to be vulnerable, these are challenges that I have and do continue to face. This is not just some idea that I've taken from out in the nether. Like, these are things that I've personally experienced. And I also see this diminishing the strength of my community. And as folks interested in the climate space, I imagine many of you are familiar with the importance of community care. You know, it's key to filling our cups and keeping us from burning out. But I've been having this thought rather often lately that I feel like I'm losing my friends to the soul-sucking nature of their jobs. And it's not just their time to engage that it's taking, but it also seems to be taking sort of their energy and their spirit and the vitality that they use to organize massive things like climate strikes or just being able to dream up new ideas or on how we can make things better. You know, youth really want physical, mental, and emotional safety in our work. We don't want to be treated like commodities, to have every drop of value squeezed out of us, but that's really difficult to find in a capitalistic, overly profit-focused society. So youth activists really need more support. We need community care that can help dismantle or mitigate the impacts of capitalism. And that can look like telling the city to support and develop infrastructure for Youth Climate Corps, the Youth Climate Corps Initiative, trust-based funding and angel impact investing so that we can pilot and test our ideas, mentorship and mentorship programs, integrating youth throughout processes instead of only during consultation periods, partnering with youth organizations, engaging in co-creation, policy suggestions for universal basic income, the list goes on. And to conclude quickly, I just wanted to add a reminder that the work doesn't stop when we reach net zero in 2040. And we'll need today's youth to be willing and able to take on the helm. So in your suggestions, conversations, and ideas, please make sure to highlight and develop ways to support youth so that we don't burn out, we don't lose trust, and we don't lose faith, and that the field itself can stay sustainable as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. support 100% everything that you're saying there, and so recognize the absolutely amazing work that youth have done, but also that incredible and really serious need for support. I see that in my own kids, and I know it's real. And whatever we can be doing to support intergenerational wealth sharing, knowledge sharing, mentorship, and all of the pieces that you mentioned there, we absolutely need to be doing that work. And I really appreciate your voice here tonight. So thank you so much for sharing. We have a short period. Let's give ourselves 5 minutes for questions. That was a really rich panel, and I'm sort of regret that we don't have more time to for Q&A, but I do want to move through the city consultation piece and the TCAN survey piece, and have a little time for breakout discussions as well. Lynn, I will pass to you to pick up a couple of questions from the chat. And thank you to all the speakers. That was such a great session. Are you there,
Okay,
Lynn?
Anne, there is
Yep.
a question for How-Sen, and just to read it here. It's what strategies, in your opinion, would work best for buildings? Incentives for the new and retrofits to be low carbon, I think we're going to say, low GHGs, or increased fees and fines if they don't use low carbon materials and energy sources, carrots or sticks?
I mean, to me, it's not a question of either or. We need like all of them, right? So what a lot of the social science study shows is that you do need some sort of stick in order for something to work. But if it's just the stick, then it tends to have negative impacts on certain communities more than others. And so ensuring that there are incentives there, that there are programs there to help those who can be more severely negatively impacted by some of these programs is absolutely vital. And then there's like the new build. So that's for like, you know, the existing building. For the new building piece, the solution is just build it the right way the first time, right? And then if you build it the right way the first time, that deals with a lot of those issues down the road. We know that buildings that are built more sustainably are cheaper to manage, cheaper to operate, are cheaper and are healthier for people who live there and for people who work there. And so we know all these things. We've known these things for 20 years. And now it's a matter of like really getting down, making sure that these programs exist and these programs are there to move people who are building new buildings, that also be looking at maintaining and retrofit existing buildings, right? And there are many developers who actually are on side. We work with certain developers who we know that are on side with this, with making sure that things are sustainable for the future. Not all of them are that way, obviously, but there are people in that industry who really do understand this as a serious challenge and something that they're willing to step up to the plate on.
Okay, thank you, How-Sen. I have a question for Gaby. Where do you place district energy in all of this? Critical to success or a pipe dream?
Oh, again, I would say that we need all the tools in the toolbox on this one. I think that there's certain elements. Toronto is a great example of a kind of community in certain areas where district energy makes a lot of sense because the density is such, and there is an existing district system that we have in place in downtown Toronto. It's using deep lake water cooling for the cooling aspects. Yes, it is still reliant on fossil fuels for building heating because it uses natural gas for a lot of its district heating on the system. But Enwave is in the process of developing their decarbonization roadmap to go low carbon district energy systems. The Etobicoke district energy system is going to be a geo exchange system. We really need to advance a lot more district energy systems in order to build the efficiency of scale associated with getting kind of like a big mass of buildings. Now, generally, District is a little bit more complicated than just dealing with things at the building scale. And so you need to be able to have every kind of tool in your toolbox to advance the low carbon options. So I would say, you know, green standards are critical to advancing it to get that at the building scale. And providing these types of N-wave options of district systems that developers can work with utilities to deliver these district energy systems and tap into this district energy systems is also critical. So I would say, no, district energy system is not a pipe dream at all. We can look at many, many, many other jurisdictions that are way ahead of us in terms of the European countries and Copenhagen, Stockholm, a whole bunch of different areas that we can learn a lot from. But it requires an energy system approach. Leaving it to developers alone to figure out and become not only real estate developers, but energy developers is not a realistic option. We need to get more of these energy systems as part of the options that they can consider, whether it be an N-wave, whether it be a diverso utilities, but we really got to streamline and make it easier for them to opt into the low carbon option. And district is definitely one of the tools in the toolbox.
Great, thanks, Gabby. And I think it's just so important to highlight the examples that are here in this city and working so people understand that the transition is underway and happening. So absolutely. I'm just noting the time, so I think I might have to pass on the remaining questions in the chat, and our apologies. But we will be collecting the questions and perhaps we can pass those along to the panelists after this event. So thank you all for such a rich conversation. I'm going to shift us now. Shelley, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slides, and we'll just sort of get into the city's consultation, the survey and the process that they've got going, and then how we can get involved and contribute to that. So great. Thanks, Shelley. So I'll try to move through this fairly quickly, but hope that it all makes sense. So as you all know, the City of Toronto has these consultations now on this critical period of its climate action plan. We've all heard some great ideas from our panelists on what we need to push for in the city's consultations. So the consultations are open now until January 31st. And a small note that this is a win from TCAN. Originally, the consultations were only going to be open until the end of this month. And we were successfully able to get the city to extend the consultation period so that we can really hear from people and communities all across this city. So important from an equity standpoint, and so that this is really informed by what we're seeing and what we want and need in our communities. So there are two options here for answering the consultation. There is an individual survey, and I would encourage absolutely everyone to do that, just because just completing that survey lets the city know that you care, and lets the city know that a lot of people really want to push forward on this climate action plan. So please do that. The individual survey will be modified depending on whether you're a homeowner, a tenant, and it will ask questions appropriate to your particular situation. So everyone, please do the individual survey. Then there is also the option of doing a group consultation, and that is what we would also really like to encourage you all to do, because this is an opportunity to get together with people in your communities, your workplace, your faith group, your biking club, your walking club, your school council, and have this conversation. So there is a group discussion guide, and we will be sharing the links to all of these pieces after this webinar, as well as in the chat. And that can also be uploaded to the same survey link through the City of Toronto's website. Next slide, please. So the city does provide an information guide for everyone, and so encourage everyone to take a look at that. I won't go into detail here. Next slide, please, Shelley. Thank you. So on the, and this is, I realize, a very information dense slide now that I'm looking at it myself, but just to note that on the group discussion guide, it's organized basically into two sections, one on climate adaptation, and the next section is on climate mitigation. And the city's questions are focused on what you as an individual are experiencing, what are the impacts you're seeing, and what you as an individual are doing about that. So that's important information that the city needs to know. And as part of this, you do put in your postal code so the city understands if you're experiencing a lot of heat. There are excellent heat maps of the City of Toronto, so we do know places where people are really experiencing serious heat in summer, but it's helpful for the city to know how people are coping with that, what actions they're taking. So there are a bunch of questions there about how you're experiencing climate impacts in your life, what changes you have made in response to these climate impacts, barriers or challenges that you're facing. So what are the things that are keeping you from adapting, whether it's financial, whether it's, there are not enough incentives, whether or not you just can't control those things in your life, and then what resources and supports would help you in overcoming those barriers. So all important information that the city needs to know. Next slide, please, Shelley. Again, way too much information on this slide, but same thing, climate mitigation. And again, it's asking us as individuals what we are doing to mitigate climate change. So what we are doing to get away and reduce our carbon pollution in our lives. So again, what are you doing in your life? What are the barriers or challenges you're facing? What resources or supports do you need? And all, again, important information. And then another question at the end of the city's survey here is, what big ideas do you have on climate adaptation or mitigation, reducing emissions that you would like to share? Again, this was a TCAN late edition, so we're really happy that this got into the city's survey. And so it's really asking residents, communities across the city for their creativity, their ideas about what they would like to see in their neighborhoods, their workplace, their communities. How could we really accelerate the implementation of the city's climate strategy? So that's the guide. All of that is available on the city's website. Encourage you all to go to that. And again, we'll be sharing the links after this webinar. Next slide, please, Shelley. So in addition to this, we at TCAN have our own survey. And this survey will be focused less on what you as an individual are doing, important information as that is for the city to know, and more about what we would like the city to be really doing. So directing our attention back at the city and back at our city councillors and our elected representatives. So in this, and this has already been covered in some of the other presentations, we do go through the different sectoral targets, which are not actually mentioned in the city's own survey. And I think it's really important information for people to have. So these sectoral targets are really ambitious, and we know that most people don't even know the existence of these targets and how important they could be in both reducing our emissions and, of course, making our city more livable, making our lives healthier, making our communities more vibrant. So I won't go into detail here on all of these different targets. That has been covered by the speakers before. And again, we will be sharing this additional TCAN survey after the webinar. And so we're asking on all of these different sectors, What do you see as the main barriers or opportunities for the city in reaching this target? And how would action in this area affect life in your community, positively or negatively? Like, what are the things that give you hope here? What are some of the concerns you'd like to bring attention to the attention of the city? Next slide, please, Shelley. Oh, yeah. So the one last question there is actually about engagement. So the city's Toronto net zero strategy really recognizes that resident engagement is critical to the success of the strategy. Right, and they are doing a lot of good work on this with their neighbourhood climate action grants, with Indigenous climate action grants. There are grants for youth as well. There is a lot of work in this area. And we understand that the city is short-staffed and under-resourced, as Maggie mentioned. But are there ways that you all could see that the city could do a better job of communicating its strategy, connecting with residents, doing outreach and doing engagement? I know so many on this call are already involved in that work and might have some really important ideas to share about how we could ramp this work up. So with all of the answers to these questions, we are ambitiously planning to put together a TCAN report to the city, which we would also share with councillors and with the mayor's office. So please, when that comes to you in your email, please also do this survey. Thank you. Next slide, please. Right, this has already been mentioned. Lynn mentioned this previously, and again, we'll share in an upcoming email, the question of provincial overreach. So we know there are these bills coming up on the bike lanes. David also mentioned the fight on the bike lane, so critical opportunities to speak up and critical opportunities to speak up on the energy issue, the expansion of the Portland's gas plants, the nuclear option. All of these things that we are not being given the opportunity to make our voices heard on in, to have sustained public consultation. Again, our provincial government is rushing us on this. Right now, there are still, however, opportunities to provide written submissions to Queen's Park and encouraging everyone to do that. Next slide, please. So now I just want to briefly turn to Val, Val, would you be able to share some information here about the Wards project, which we're looking to start gaining some momentum on. So Val, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anne. Yeah, the Wards Project is an idea that grassroots action groups such as Climate Fast, one of the ones I participate in, are hoping to find people in every ward willing to form small committees to engage councillors on Transform TO. Many councillors need to be better informed about the net zero by 2040 strategy, and those that are informed and are actively promoting the strategy need constituents backing them up. So in addition to forging a relationship with our councillors, this constituents groups might also consider doing outreach in their neighborhoods to educate the general public about Transform TO. Holding conversations about Transform TO's next 5-year plan, which is what a lot of tonight's been about encouraging, it would be a really great place to start. So encouraging people to fill out the surveys and to perhaps write as a group and go talk to councillors. Some wards already have active groups, of which many members are probably here tonight. I know of Don Valley West, Eglinton Lawrence, and Harvard Village. Those are 3 that I know already. And we're really keen to talk to people in those groups to see if they are working on Transform TO specifically. If so, we'd love to learn from them. And if they're not, we invite them to participate in this project. So if you as an individual or your local group are interested in joining this Wards project, we invite you to fill out the form that's going to be provided in the chat. Perhaps it has already, and we'll get back to you. We're planning training sessions. We need to learn from you what you feel you need training on. So about how to meet with a counselor, or how to facilitate discussions, or learning more about the details of Transform TO. So please, when you fill out our form, add, if you'd like training and what you'd like training in. And if you have any questions, you can email them to lynn@climatefast.ca. And I think she's put that in the chat as well. So thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Val. Well, a wealth of resources for everyone here tonight and a wealth of opportunities. I would now like to shift to the presentation from Anjum. Anjum, you're going to give us this opportunity now, I feel, to connect policy with poetry and communicating with our fellow human beings. So super happy to have you on the call to give us some ideas about how to facilitate conversations in a good way. So a brief introduction to Anjum. Anjum Chagpar was born in Toronto to immigrants from India and Tanzania. She's a parent, gardener, cyclist, human factors engineer, and systems designer. After spending more than 20 years working on health systems transformation, in 2022, she founded Good Futures Collective in order to better address the root causes of poor health. That is our disconnection from each other and the land. Good Futures works in communities throughout Toronto's neighbourhood improvement areas to co-create and practice the futures we desire now, using speculative fiction, art, poetry, and other tools to subvert pervasive linear climate narratives. We've probably heard quite a few linear climate narratives tonight, and it's good to have some of those narratives, but it's also really good to step out of those narratives as well. So now over to you, Anjum, and thank you again.
Thanks so much. And next slide, please. So the first idea is, let's meet in person. I think our default is always quite often meeting virtually, and for good reason. But I know when I'm facilitating, my anxiety drops when I hear that the meeting is going to be in person, because I know I'll have so much more information. As humans, we're taking in millions of bits of information every second through our bodies, through our senses. It's really hard to do that when we're disembodied faces on a two-dimensional screen. And I think meeting in person has relevance for the work that we're doing. Our work is embodied. Our work is about our bodies and our connection to our physical, natural world. So I think for a lot of reasons, it makes sense to meet in person, which is not to say that meeting in person is not without challenges. But this work is not without challenges, so there's some symmetry there. And when we actually have conversations about what people need to attend meetings, what barriers we have to disrupt for people to attend, we're learning a skill, we're practicing a skill that's going to help us in our climate action. So, asking people, do you need a ride? Do you want me to take care of your kids? What kind of assistive devices might you need? All of that, we're practicing a muscle for building community, and understanding that community building is a form of climate action, I think is really important. We also, when we meet in person and we have these conversations, we're practicing generosity and reciprocity, also two really important things for the work that we're all doing. Next slide, please. My second idea is to be explicit when we open our conversations about our interconnection. I think a beautiful way to do that and a meaningful way to do that is with a land acknowledgement. With a land acknowledgement, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen. With a land acknowledgement, specifically for people who are living in so-called Toronto, we have an obligation to peaceably share and care for the land surrounding the Great Lakes. We are all treaty people. So that brings us into community, just that common acknowledgement that we're sharing this land and we're sharing responsibilities for this land. I think also when we start conversations and we start meetings with things like music and poetry and storytelling, we're also recognizing that we have a collective lineage. We all have the same ancestors, and we all have learned to tell stories as a means of sharing information and sharing wisdom. And I love this story about the hummingbird and the forest fire, which many of you may have heard, but I'll tell it really quickly. So there's a massive forest fire burning, and all of the animals in the forest are running in all sorts of directions to outrun the fire. And the fire is spreading quickly. And as the animals are running, there's a cheetah that's looking up, and he notices a hummingbird going back into the forest. He keeps running, and as he's running, he notices that this hummingbird is going into the forest and coming out of the forest, going into the forest and coming out of the forest. So the cheetah stops the hummingbird and says, "Hummingbird, what are you doing? Like, there's a big fire. You need to come with us. Let's go." And the hummingbird says, "Oh yeah, there's a lake up ahead, and I'm going there, and I'm filling my beak with a drop of water, and I'm coming back to the forest, and I'm dropping it on the fire." And the cheetah is like, "Hummingbird, you know that's not going to make a difference. You know, you know that, right?" And the hummingbird says, "Cheetah, the forest is my home. I was born there. My parents were born there. My children were born there. The forest has fed me her nectar, and I pollinate her flowers. She is part of me, and I am part of her. And I can't run away from her any more than I can run away from myself." And while the cheetah and the hummingbird are having this conversation, the spirits of the forest and the spirits of the lake and the spirits of the sky are overhearing this conversation, and they conspire to create a great storm. The skies darken, the clouds get heavy, and a rainfall is unleashed that is massive and puts out the fire. So I love starting meetings with stories and poems, and then opening up a space for reflection and sharing about what that might mean. It also gives us an opportunity to be vulnerable, to develop trust, and also assess power asymmetry. Now, power is subjective, of course, but what I mean by this is that we can learn a little more about how best to facilitate equitable conversations by understanding how people share and what they share up at the top of the meeting. Next slide, please. The third idea is to reframe crisis as opportunity. I heard this phrase, practicing horror, recently, and I realized, oh my gosh, that's what we're doing, arguably before COVID, but definitely since COVID. There are so many concurrent crises happening right now. It's not to diminish the fact that they are happening, but what happens to us is we get into our reptilian brains, our amygdala, and we are in a flight or fight mode, which is one based in fear. And when we're scared, it makes it so easy to other each other and much more difficult to connect. We revert to linear thinking. We're not as creative. And so the way to get out of our amygdala and into our frontal lobe is to practice gratitude. So to start with conversations about, what do I love about my neighborhood? What's the best thing about living here? And maybe even like, what are some things that other people have no idea about this neighborhood, but are super, super interesting or super cool? In my neighborhood, every day without fail at 7 p.m., we call him the reggae man. He drives by, and it's a fleeting moment because he's in his car. He passes our house and everybody's house with his windows down, blaring reggae music. And it's such good music. It happens every day at 7, like clockwork. I used to put my kids to bed, time to brush your teeth. Reggae man just went by. And it happens, and it's been happening for years. And in a world where things are changing so rapidly, I love him so much for the comfort that he provides me and all of my neighbors by traveling through and playing his music. So I love this quote here, in an effort to protect what is being lost, how do we make sure we're appreciating what is fighting to remain? After frustrating new laws passed, do we take a moment to bring bread to our neighbors, Do we watch the sunset after a brutal storm? Have we acted as if there were possibilities other than destruction? Have we taken steps to show that our liberation is tied to that of others? I think, context is important, framing is important. Next slide, please. So the last idea is kind of a preemptive response to my own conditioning and biases about like, what's the real work? What's the real work? Like, that's all nice to have. Those 3 ideas are great, but let's get to the real work, and often we don't have time. So I need to remind myself that actually, what if this is the real work? This is getting together and having these discussions and recognizing that we're interconnected, recognizing that we still have things to be grateful for, recognizing that, all bodies need to be participating in this work. What if that is just as valuable as, the outcomes? I think also we have a pervasive and incorrect metaphor that we practice a lot, which is that time is money. And so we run out of time. We don't have enough time. We're wasting time. But time is not anything like money. And there are a lot of cultures, historic and present day, that have very different notions of what time is. So the ancient Greeks, for example, have this concept of serpentine time. That time actually folds back on itself so that the past, present, and future collapse. And so I think we need to challenge ourselves in a time when we think we're in this urgent culture, urgent, running out of time all the time, to question what we mean by time. And I think that it's important to do this work by holding space for whatever comes up. This work is not easy. This crisis is complex. Climate change is complex. People are complex. But that's okay. It's okay to recognize that, and it's okay for things to get messy. We don't have to end our meetings, all neat and tidy, because messy is how the caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Decomposition is how we fertilize the soil so that new things can grow. And those are my ideas. Next slide, I guess. So yeah, hopefully you have ideas as well, and maybe during the breakout sessions, you have an opportunity to discuss them too.
Thanks so much, Anjum. That was lovely and a wonderful reminder to ground ourselves in our relationships with each other and our relationships with the other than human world that we are all trying to protect. So speaking of messy, we will now have moved to breakout sessions. We have a little less time because of all the amazing panelists and conversations that we've had, but nevertheless, it would be wonderful to have a moment to get to know who else is on this call. And importantly, the breakout sessions, we have organized them by ward or region of the city. So this will be an opportunity to get to know your neighbors as well, find out, who is hosting or attending a consultation, and who might be interested in the wards project, and just an opportunity to get to know each other. So I will now ask David, who is our Zoom guru, to send us all off into our breakout rooms. And so we'll have a few minutes there, and then we'll be back, let's say 8:57, and we can wrap up at that point. Thank you.
So Anne, because you didn't come up on the screen that I was trying to sort, I put Jacinta in that room as well, differently. Just so you know.
Okay.
So you're not going in, you're still going to stay in the big room.
Okay.
And it was difficult because a lot of people's names changed from their registration name.
Oh, a challenge. I see.
No, it's not the end of the world, but it's just, so how much time do we have now? And we only have 7. So Lynn, wherever Lynn is, we only have 7 unassigned participants at this point. So the bigger room, The bigger room is only about 7 people now.
That's all right.
I
That's
thought
great.
you'd like that.
So I should go
And
into room 4 then? Is that what I'm doing?
you could, oh
Okay.
yes, sorry, I thought I already
Okay.
sent you there.
Yeah, you did, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure
I'm
if it
sorry,
was done.
Jacinta,
Okay,
I
no
didn't know
worries.
how to
Okay, thanks,
contact you and
David.
let you know.
Okay,
I
bye.
did. Bye, see you soon.
I'm gonna join Etobicoke.
Oh, you're gonna join too? Good
I'm
for
going
you.
to Etobicoke, unless there's a reason for me to stay here.
Go
Well,
to Etobicoke, How-Sen. Sounds good. I'm not seeing any like I'm not getting instructions about breakout rooms on my screen. So
no, I don't think you will because they
okay.
all come in a separate place. But what I really do need to know from you though is the
Mhm.
timing now, because to send people notice that there's, because again, you initially it said 22 minutes and now it's being dropped to 16 or
Well, we have to wrap up by 9.
I
That-
know that's
yeah.
good for you. I'm
Yeah.
afraid that's the rule that most of us go by.
Yeah.
We're
So
all short attention spans at this time of night.
right.
particularly.
We may have been a little ambitious with how much to include in this webinar.
Yeah, but what the hell, we all do that. But
I
what
know.
time should I say? 15 max?
So yeah, let's see if we can bring folks back.
10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, gotcha. That's what I
Yeah,
need to know.
it'll be brief, but
Yeah,
at least
no,
we
and that's a
can-
good, because they're gonna be,
Ward.
I'm afraid the other thing was that the names that were all sorted by ward, they were all got discombobulated. So what I tried to do is at least have them equal size, so.
Okay. Oh, and David, I'm just we've stopped recording at this point.
Yes, good for you. Good
Thank
for
you.
you. No, that's very important.
Anyway, we'll cut that.
No, that's very important. I always, it's one of those things that, yeah.